Without further ado, I'm really honoured to introduce Dr. Amani. Dr. Amani is an urban ethnographer working at the intersection of sociology, anthropology, and geography. Her work explores the interplay between racialization and spatialization, with a specific focus on Muslims in the global north. Her PhD research was a comparative ethnography of young Muslims' urban lives in Denmark and Quebec, exploring class, racialization, and urban life. She holds an MA in anthropology from the University of Copenhagen and a PhD in social and cultural analysis from Concordia in Canada. And she's currently the Sociological Review Fellow 2020-21. So I will now, with pleasure, hand over to Amani.
Thank you, Satya. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for inviting me for this event, Satya. I'm really excited about this. I'm just going to share my presentation with you all. The sounds outside, but I'll just try to speak a little bit louder. Just let me know if you can't hear me. So what do I mean when I talk about racialization in nations without states? So it's really interesting to talk about race or racialization in a context such as Denmark, because in Denmark, it's basically unheard of on a national level, on a political level, to talk about race in the same way we kind of know from the British history of race relations, or you know, the work and scholarship that's gone into looking at race in the UK context is something that's very absent in the Danish context. Scholars are much more comfortable talking about ethnic relations or ethnic minorities, ethnic Danes versus ethnic minorities. That's kind of how you phrase racialized differences. But I want to kind of just challenge that way of speaking about minorities, racialized minorities in Denmark, because I think it misses something when we do not talk about what is meant in a political context. So Denmark may be seen as a progressive liberal state by most people around the world. It was voted the happiest country in the world. And I think by some sort of parameters of comparisons of the living standards and how people live, but who are we talking to when we decide that a country is good or happy? Are we actually acknowledging the inequalities that happen within that country? So this is why I want to kind of just bring back the conversation of racialization, drawing on scholarship from the UK, drawing from scholarship from the US, saying that we actually have to rethink these concepts the way they've been thinking about it in these contexts. We need to rethink it when we're talking about countries such as Denmark, because how do we talk about racism and race in a country where these concepts are non-existent, where racism is seen as individualized bias, but not understood as inherent structural inequalities. And so I want to kind of just, the last point on this slide, I want to just bring back the conversation to the connection between nationalism and racialization as inherent processes and interrelated processes. This isn't new. Paul Gilroy was talking about this back in the late 80s, but this is really important to understand in the context of Denmark, where scholarship will look into nationalism, but very little understanding or conceptualization of racism and racialization as processes. So I'm going to just jump ahead from this slide to actually talking about Islamophobia, because I want us to just open up the conversation of saying, so if we're talking about racialization, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about phenotypical differences between white populations and non-white populations, or are we talking about something else? Now, when we're talking about Muslims in the context of Denmark, yes, part of it is phenotypical differences, but that's not how it's so it's not how it's explained in national discourse or political discourse. In political discourse, it's not the color of my skin that makes me racialized necessarily. It may be an indicator of my Muslimness, of my non-Westernness, but what's inherently the problem with racialized Muslims in Denmark is their cultural religious differences and their insistence on being different from the hegemonic majority, being white Danes. So I wanted us to just come back to looking at the definition of Islamophobia that I want to draw on here today. So I'm not gonna go through this whole quote, but this is the definition that the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project provides at UC Berkeley. Now, I want you to kind of just notice a few elements in this definition. It builds on existing Eurocentric and Orientalist global power structures. It is about maintaining and extending existing disparities in economic, political, social, and cultural relations. And finally, it reintroduces and reaffirms a global racial structure through which resource distribution disparities are maintained and extended. Now, if we understand Islamophobia as this, we're not talking about necessarily about specific individualized biases against the Muslims from one person to another person. But we're actually talking on a much more structural level. So taking that as our starting point of understanding Islamophobia, like other racisms and other types of racism, is not about the person being racialized, it's about the structures that are being maintained, the racialized structures that are being maintained. And this isn't, if you look at Danish policies, you'll see a lot of this being kind of promoted inadvertently and kind of washed out. It's being washed out in the actual narrative, but it always is brought up in the political rhetoric that is presented to the population in Denmark. We're talking about non-Western citizens. We're talking about Muslim citizens, if you absolutely have to highlight that. But everyone knows that the categorization, the legal definition of non-Westerners in Denmark is publicly imagined to be a Muslim. So what are we talking about when we're talking about who these non-Westerners are, or Muslims in the Danish context? I think here it's important to understand that Denmark, as a progressive liberal country, will never, except for a few political figures, will never actually say all Muslims are bad. That's not the question. The question is that there are differences between Muslims. There are the good ones and there are the bad ones. And you see here, I wanted to just sideline them. And it may be very similar to other racialized groups that we know from other places. But the good Muslim is the one who is, their political criticism is within the boundaries of the nation state. So they may criticize political parties, but they're affiliated with other political parties. If you do not engage with the nation state, or if you're critical of the whole state, then you may fall into the bad side of this equation. You're loyal to the nation. You emphasize your Danishness. I'm a Danish Muslim, and this is important to me. You're disciplined. You're productive. You work, and you work hard, and you are successful in your work. So you contribute to society. This is something that came up again and again in the narratives of my interlocutors in Denmark. You're respectable, you have good manners, you have good character. And then on the other side, so these are usually accepted in the general public. These are usually, but there's always there's sometimes these encounters where there's a questioning of it. Are you really good? Are you really adhering to our values, whatever these are, whatever is the predominant opinion of society? Then you have the bad Muslims, the ones who are you're always kind of a balancing act. I have to make sure that everyone around me understands that I'm a good Muslim, just so I don't fall into the category of a bad Muslim. So in this sense, Islamophobia isn't about understanding Islam or having closed or open understandings or views about Islam, but it's about maintaining the hegemonic hierarchy, which is essentially racialized in a country such as Denmark, where 95% of the population is white. It will always be about adhering to what the hegemonic values of society is. So just to sum up some of the things I wanted to highlight here. So racialization is a tool for the rulers to implement on the rule. So it's something for the powerful of society to implement. Muslims are seen as a monolith in spite of cultural and phenotypical diversity. So I think this is really interesting in a Danish context, where Muslims are usually in statistics and in policy referred to as non-Western immigrants and descendants, going back at least 2 generations, but they're talking about including the 3rd generation. So imagine someone such as myself, whose family immigrated back in the 60s and 70s. I am still, statistically speaking, I am still referred to as a non-Western citizen of Denmark. So this is really a quintessential way of creating the monolith. It's a colorblind racialization of who's assumed to be Muslim. You're not assumed to be Muslim if you're from Australia, but you're assumed to be Muslim if you're from Pakistan. So Australian would be a Western immigrant and descendant, and the Pakistani will obviously be a non-Western. So, and I think this is really interesting in my own research in Denmark, because it meant that a lot of my interlocutors wouldn't talk about being of different Middle Eastern descent or Pakistani or Turkish or whatever. They would talk about themselves as being of other ethnic heritage or non-Westerners. They would kind of take this categorizing this all kind of like the BME category is in the UK. This way of kind of gathering everyone under one racializing rubric. So I think is one other thing that's really important to understand here is that racialization of Muslims is both a discursive and a political process. And so Islamophobia is a consequence of this process. If we look at it as in terms of political rhetoric and in policy documents, the discursive process is first, politicians in Denmark will introduce a certain policy or an idea for a policy that then gets enforced through public discourse, through public debate. And then whatever happens as a consequence of this process, as a consequence of a particular policy, is where Islamophobia is kind of allowed to be rooted. So if you look at the Danish policies right now in housing policies, where Muslims or non-Westerners are increasingly discriminated against in access to affordable housing. Now, the Islamophobia as a consequence of this process is about looking at where these Muslims or non-Westerners choose, what schools they choose to go to, what jobs do they have, or if they're unemployed. So how do they meet these policies in public services, in public institutions? So in Denmark, we're not talking about illiberal forms of racism. We're not talking about racist violence on a structural level per se, like not physical violence. Someone could argue that the border control of Denmark could be interpreted as violence, but in the everyday life, we're not talking about these forms of racism. We're talking about a much more liberal form of racism and Islamophobia. Not all Muslims are bad. They're good and bad Muslims, as I was saying. Now, this type of Islamophobia is implemented through heightened border control especially towards immigrants and refugees coming from Muslim majority countries. Stricter criminal laws are facing these, especially dual nationals, people such as myself who have, or not myself, but other descendants and immigrants who have two citizenships. They can face severe consequences, and if facing the criminal justice system of being deported, housing policies, education policies, and all that. So what I've been highlighting here is very much affecting people who are, or Muslims who are socially and economically marginalized. What my research then looks at, what happens when we include a class perspective that looks at someone who is highly socially mobile, someone who has a good job and a university degree. How are they experiencing this reality? How are they experiencing these policies? And what's interesting is that, and I'm going to come back to this as we're talking about the ethnographic part of my research, but it's really interesting how the conversation doesn't veer off of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, what do you call it, line or dichotomy. You know, it's about proving oneself to be good towards the wider society. But before I go into, just to check the time, before I go into this, I wanted to just look at this map. This is a municipality map by the Danish or Copenhagen's municipality, and it shows how where on the map where non-Western immigrants and descendants live in and near the city center of Copenhagen. All the red spots here are where there's more than 18% non-Westerners, and then it trickles down. You can see the little rubric on the right corner in the bottom that tells you where there's more or less non-Westerners living here. So what's important about this map isn't the fact that it shows this very racializing, where all my non-Westerners live. It's actually, this is a map for the social economic map of Copenhagen. So on the same map, you can choose which parts you want to highlight, where people are employed or unemployed, where people make more money or less money. So it's in this context. It's not in the context of where different ethnic groups or communities live, but it's about where a non-Westerner here is an example of socioeconomic deprivation. It just shows how much it's ingrained within the structures of this is a very obvious, oh yeah, of course non-Westerners figure in this type of map, interactive map, where you can see where safety is, where the crime rate is, and then where all the minorities live. So just briefly on my research. So I did ethnographic research in Copenhagen looking at young Muslims. So this is part of a wider project where I compared young Muslims in Denmark and Copenhagen with young Muslims in Montreal and Canada. And I think that there's some really interesting elements that are highlighted throughout my interlocutors' conversations with me. And one thing about Islamophobia I think is really important to mention is that it has a very gendered way of expressing itself. So Muslim women are seen as oppressed, while Muslim men are seen as aggressive. So when in these encounters, my interlocutors are attempting to prove themselves as good Muslims, the Muslim woman would try to create a narrative of being strong, independent, independent of her family, independent of her male relative, while the Muslim man is trying to seem approachable, seem nice, share about their personal lives, smile more, be happy. And I think this says a lot about, without even talking about Islamophobia, without even talking about racialization, it just became intuitively ingrained into their narratives of this is just how I get people to, you know, understand I'm a good person. So it requires different gender tactics of navigating this kind of, I often talk about these eggshells that are laid around them because of how political discourse has just framed them as someone to be wary of. We need to be wary of our Muslim citizens here. We have to just see where they stand on certain issues. So a lot of my interlocutors are really talking about creating this upward social mobility in spaces that are kind of rigged against them. You know, if you have to talk to a supervisor, really convince them about the fact that you're actually a nice guy before they will hire you, or before they will keep you hired, then there's certain roadblocks on the way that that's not made explicit. You just have a feeling that it's there. And I think it's important to also just mention this idea of double consciousness in this, because I think if we talk about racist encounters, all of my interlocutors would know how to highlight these in their lives, but that's not what was the basis of their narratives. It was more this idea of I'm presenting myself because I know how they see me, so I have to respond to that way of seeing me, or counter that way of seeing me, for me to really be able to engage with people. This is on the social level, right? So right now we're talking away from policy, away from political rhetoric, to just everyday encounters. How do I talk to my peers at university? How do I talk to my teacher when politicians are telling her that guys who look like me are potentially violent criminals or potential terror threat? So this is an example I wanted to kind of just show, just highlighting the last point I just made. This was a young Idris. I gave certain names to all my interlocutors, so it's not his real name, but one thing he mentioned to me as he was talking, and he's a young man, he was 19 at the time. He was telling me how his school teacher, his English teacher, was actually very bigoted. But then he said, but I make them understand that immigrants aren't criminal or violent. My English teacher actually told me that I changed her mind. So instead of actually focusing on the fact that the issue is actually her racist bias, he put it on his shoulder to prove her wrong. Now, whether or not that teacher, you know, made him the exception to the rule, or actually understood that there are you know, differences in people, I think it's also important to mention that with such a racializing discourse, the internalization of being an immigrant, of being you know, an other, is really high in a lot of my interlocutors' conversations, and I think why a lot of them will really emphasize their Danishness. So Idris, for instance, he was born and raised in Denmark, and his mom came when she was an infant. And it just goes to show how problematic, you know, dominant discourses of otherization is and affects young people's lives. So this is another example I wanted to highlight, and this is about Musa, a young man who works he works in a hotel, and he talks about, you know, how to be subtle in challenging these hegemonic values, quote unquote. So he says, initially I tried to indicate that I'm Muslim. And that's another thing. As a man, it's not always obvious whether or not you're Muslim, but you're often racialized as such because of your phenotypical appearance. So if a colleague invites me to go to Christmas lunch or something else un-Islamic, I try to reject it in a subtle way. A problem I often face because I work in a hotel, most receptionists are young women, so there's a chance of physical contact, for example, shaking hands. And I usually use this line: I only shake hands with the old or ugly, and you're neither. So for him to kind of just be able to challenge that way and still adhere to certain values that he holds personally, he tries to flatter young women to say, you know, I can't shake your hands because you're too pretty. Now, the integration minister of that time called his bluff on this, and she actually introduced a policy of having to shake hands because she understood that this is an opinion that some men and women, Muslim men and women have. And she highlights here in this quote from a newspaper report, if you don't want to shake hands with the mayor during the citizenship ceremony, it can be understood as a clear sign that you don't believe in gender equality. And that's inherently why there are Muslims who don't want to shake hands with the opposite gender. So I definitely think you could say this is essential. So she's making certain, and she can only do this during the citizenship ceremony. So because when you're trying to become Danish, you really have to adhere to the hegemonic values. But here it's also really clear that Muslims are who needs to be put in their places in terms of what kind of values they try to live by in their everyday lives. I wanted to just bring an example. I see that the time is running a little past me, but I wanted to highlight also an example from a young woman. And she wears the hijab, and she explains how she experienced wearing the hijab for the first time in her life. And she says, I met resistance from the surrounding society saying I should take it off. Tell your father you don't have to wear it. I often felt defensive. I actually have a free choice. No, my parents aren't strict or have high academic requirements. And no, I'm not forced into marriage. It just requires a lot of energy to continuously try to climb out of the box they put you in, especially in high school. So Iman here explains something that kind of followed her throughout her life. She also described in a different place in her interview where she actually experienced this throughout her even young childhood. But this idea that she has to fight this idea of her oppression. Oh no, I actually made this choice on my own, and no, I'm not forced into marriage. There was so many eggshells around her throughout her life, in her engagement and in her encounters with white Danes, that she actually kept it a secret from her Danish peers at university that she had gotten married in her early 20s. This is in a context where having a serious relationship in your 20s is pretty much accepted. But as soon as a Muslim woman is saying that she is married, there's a different narrative that's connected to this. And the narrative is presented here by Annette Wilhelmsen, she was the Minister of Social Affairs and Integration in 2013. She explains here, and there's a point here to also make about the political spectrum. Annette Wilhelmsen is part of the left-center party, while the integration minister I mentioned before is part of the right-leaning, right-center party. So this is a discourse that covers the political spectrum in Danish rhetoric. Now, Annette Wilhelmsen says here, many new Danish youth, and new Danish youth is synonymous to non-Western, is synonymous to Muslim, ethnic minorities. They kind of all fall under the same rubric of just being racialized others. Many new Danish youth are exposed to social control. This is especially relevant regarding choosing a spouse, boyfriend or girlfriend, and sex before marriage. We cannot as a society accept this, and this is our joint task to be clear about the rules which Denmark is based upon, and actively seek to make sure that the concepts such as honor does not stand in the way for young people's right for self-determination. that is why I'm happy to launch the campaign, A Question of Honor, so we can make sure that young people know their rights. Now, this campaign was the first introduction of the idea of negative social control, which has now today become policy. And it's a requirement, a safeguarding requirement for everyone in public institutions to flag if they think a young woman especially is a victim of social control by her male relatives. But this is kind of like promoting this, I call it sexual surveillance, but just hyper emphasis on not just how you live as a Muslim, but also the social and romantic relationships you have as a Muslim, which explains why Iman really didn't want to share with her peers the fact that she was married, because she knew what kind of line of questioning would follow that statement. So just because of time, let me just introduce you to just one last example of how this double consciousness is really just goes all the way through. And this is the idea of respectability, or creating, making one's personal life palatable. And here Khaled, a young man, says you have to step up when you need to. You also have to make an effort. You have to build relationship, and that's what I did with my supervisor. Initially, she didn't like me, and I understood from the way he was explaining it, she didn't like him because what she assumed he was as a Muslim man, and she didn't want to hire me. But I made a good impression. I was open with her when we spoke about our private lives. She definitely had her prejudice, and I had to take them down slowly. So can you feel the eggshells that are put around him as well? And I asked him, so isn't it just really annoying having to deal with this type of prejudice? And then Khalid says, no, it's not annoying, it's a necessity. You're not like everyone else. You have to remember you're Muslim first and foremost. You have to show your best qualities, because you can't fail. Because then you can't fail to display good manners and akhlaq, or character. So basically, he took it as his own responsibility. The same way Idris took it on himself as well, to just make sure that you show your best qualities. You're a good person. And I think just to allow time for just a discussion right now, just highlighting the fact that this structural Islamophobia is a way of curbing Muslims' agency. And I think this really comes out in these different quotes that I highlighted. And I think with that, let me just stop talking right now and open the floor to our discussants, just to allow time for a conversation as well.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It was so insightful and detailed, and I just really want to read more of your research now. I feel like that wasn't enough, I wanted more. But I really liked your discussion on the idea of good Muslims and bad Muslims, and understanding that these definitions and ideas function as a form of disciplining Muslim autonomy, because I think it's definitely something we've all faced. And it's really scary, because the existence of that binary of, good versus bad forces you to either live your life as you want and potentially be criminalized for that, or publicly define yourself as a good or liberal Muslim in order to fit in and construct yourself as someone who is not too Muslim to be perceived as problematic, or, like you said, as someone to be wary of. But then that also means you're playing into the political framework that's been created around your identity, and means that your very existence as a so-called good Muslim then implies the idea that bad Muslims do exist. So those comments you get about how you don't seem that bad, or at least don't like those religious ones. So I don't know, it feels like you can never really win, which is definitely very depressing. So, and I always find that whenever I read into research about Islamophobia, the conclusions usually always make me feel quite hopeless, because everything seems so embedded or structural and too inherent in the fabric of society at this point to feel as though anything can get better. So what I'd really like to know is if you found anything positive in your research so far. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel?
I completely agree with your understanding of what's highlighted, and I think there's a lot of concern when we're only looking at the structures, when we're only looking at the policies, and we're only looking at the rhetoric, and also see how these play out in people's lives. Like, I think we can't bypass the fact that it affects the young people I met and spoke to in different ways. And I think, so just, I can myself become a bit hopeless when I just am consumed by how these things really trickle down and affect people's lives. One thing I really think is really useful to think with, and I didn't have time to go into this, but what I did with these young people, I also did spatial tours with them. I walked with them through their cities, and we spoke about how they're embedded within their city spaces. And this is kind of like moving away from the political context and going back down to how people actually are able to navigate these political structures. How are people able to create meaning in spite of it? And I think that's where hope really lies, is really being able to creatively use creatively use yourself and your life and your life embeddedness within the place you live in, to create something meaningful to you. And I think this, when we go from national rhetoric and seeing how that trickles down to encounters, it can be overwhelming to just focus on that. But by looking at other ways of using the spaces around you, of living your life, you find actually there's a lot of hope in these narratives as well. I think there's a lot of hope in being able to say, this is my home turf, this is my street, this is where I always come. I love that cafe. I've been going to this ice cream shop since I was 5 years old, and this is my life, no matter what people in power say about me, about how much I don't fit in here. This city is mine, and you can see that when you actually start walking around these young people, and when the conversation goes away from being good Muslim or being the product of being successful, being middle class, and this is what shows. So Khalid was explaining to me, like, I've been successful in my work because I was able to break down these barriers, these prejudices. But then, if we leave that conversation and just look at where he used to do sports, where he had his best friends growing up, and where like there are meaningful encounters with also white Danish peers and teachers and coaches, this is away from the way. And I think this is where the really interesting conversation between structure and agency really comes to play, because we can easily become hopeless in looking at that. But if we look at agency, not necessarily just as a way of mobilizing and dismantling and resisting explicitly power structure, but also as a capacity of action, as a way of being able to navigate oppressive structures, I think is where hope really lies.
Thank you for that. I think Samiha was going to say something as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so amazing, and like I felt like we could relate and learn from so much of the things that you mentioned. So I wanted to talk about how in Denmark they were voted the happiest people in the world, and relate it back to the UK when recently there was like a race report saying that the racism isn't a problem anymore within the UK. And I just wanted to talk about how like invisible Islamophobia is to them, and the idea that like even when I was in school, Islamophobia felt like it didn't exist, and it always was played off as like banter. For example, like if you were walking down the corridor and your headscarf just got pulled off you, or terrorist jokes, and it was never condemned in the way that it should have been, and it was played off as like a bit of fun. And even when you went to the teachers, they never saw it as something which was like really problematic. Obviously it was just seen as like, oh, don't do that again, like just a normal telling off, not something that was like very Islamophobic. And more so that the teachers were in support of the prevent strategy. In my school, when we had a boy who running down, an Asian boy who was running down the corridor, and he got reported for like gang behavior. And similarly, like this invisibility can be seen in the experiences of Azim Rafiq, what's been happening to him in the Yorkshire cricket club, and how it was just seen as a bit of banter when a lot of his white teammates were like forcing him to drink wine and calling him the P word. So I just wanted to ask, like, do you feel this lack of acknowledgement worsens Islamophobia or just makes it less visible?
I think that's a really good question. I think so speaking from the Danish context, there's no, so if racism is barely recognized, Islamophobia is definitely not recognized, all the way up to academic levels. You know, I don't think there's many scholars in Denmark who look at Islamophobia specifically as a serious type of racism in Denmark. Although, as you were mentioning, I think a lot of us, a lot of Muslims who were born and raised in Denmark have experienced, you know, all of the things that you relate to in different forms. I think there's, to answer it, to try to answer it, I think there's something problematic by not acknowledging it. I think one thing that I noticed amongst my interlocutors, if you can't talk about racism, if you can't talk about Islamophobia as specific form of racism, you really don't have a way of processing not just your own experiences, but also mobilizing on these issues. I think there's something around specific ways racism is expressed in Denmark, because Muslims are the largest racialized group, or people of Muslim descent are the largest racialized group in Denmark. A lot of racism is really around Islamophobia. And if we're not talking about racism, and if we're not specifying how Islamophobia is a distinct form of racism, we can't even see how these things interconnect with and intersect with other types of racism. So, for instance, Somalis in Denmark are experiencing a number of different ways racism expressed, both anti-Blackness and Islamophobia, all wrapped up into one, as well as border controls and xenophobia. If we're not actually as both as scholars and anti-racist activists, you know, specifying how these different types of racism are expressed, not just both in everyday life, but also through these policies, as you mentioned, this prevent and so on. You know, how are they? And in Denmark, there are other policies. There's the ghetto policies, there's the social control policies, and there's also CVE policies. You know, how are all these forms of structural racism intersecting? So how is border control intersecting with anti-Blackness and xenophobia and Islamophobia? And as you may have noticed in the slides I used, Danish parliamentarians, Danish politicians, and at the highest level of the power chain in Denmark, are not shy from specifying that it is directly Muslims that we're targeting with certain policies, and how this translates into it translates into social encounters. So if a young woman or man doesn't want to shake hands, oh, well, the integration minister said this is a core value of our society, and you're Muslim, right? So all of a sudden your autonomy, you know, as an individual, as your ability to act in this situation is really limited. So I think that's a really important question to consider. I think, yes, I think that it is important to just highlight how it goes from the upper levels down to everyday encounters.
Thank you so much, Amani, and thank you so much, Samiha, however, your really, really insightful experiences that you shared with us and your questions. I'm aware there's about 10 minutes left, and I think there's 3 people who've asked if they can ask questions. So over to Hannah first.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting and important. And I'm just going to ask a very quick question because I know there's other people that want to ask questions too. I just had a quick question about the ideas of the nation and these deracialized discourses you discussed. And I was wondering how the concept or the idea of the family is stereotyped around the nation. I know there's been work around gender and intergenerational kind of culture and all these kind of racialized ideas. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the concept of the family, if possible. Thank you.
Do you mean the family as the non-Western family, or the family Denmark?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So I was thinking more about the kind of ideas of the non-Western family as this kind of gendered stereotype around, passing on intergenerational culture and all these kind of ideas.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, and I asked this question because I think there's an interesting way of, like, if you look at nationalist discourse in Denmark, there's a lot of values around, the family, the working mom and dad, and then the children who are raised, to, like, they go to nurseries, they go to schools, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, so this is the proper family, and then there's the Muslim family. So in policy, it's non-Western. So just like I use Muslim because I want to kind of hit, I want to emphasize that it's the when Danish policies talk about non-Westerns, they literally mean Muslims, but you can't register people's religion, but you can register where their parents were born, where they were born. And so non-Westerns, Western countries are really categorized as a specific set of countries. Most of them are majority Muslim countries, or at least non-white countries, if that makes sense. So just to highlight that, I think a lot of especially the negative social control policies are about or about certain stereotypes of the Muslim family, where the man is seen as oppressive to the women in the family. The women in the family have nothing to say. The brothers are, the aggressive man, the aggressive Muslim man, and the oppressed Muslim woman. It's literally taken out of the Orientalist textbook of saving the brown woman from the brown man. So a lot of these policies that are implemented of saying, like, one of the, like, teachers have a responsibility to like note down if they suspect some sort of social control, basically parents wanting their kids to not drink, to not have extramarital sex or whatever. So there's a trying to go into the Muslim family and trying to decide what values are implemented. So one of the policy requirements for the ghetto policy, which is the policy of social housing in Denmark, looking specifically at housings with more than 50% non-Western residents. One of the policies is children as young as 1 year old must go to nursery to learn Danish values. They should not be at home with their parents where there's a risk of them learning Muslim values or whatever cultural values that non-Westerners have. That's implemented in policy. This is from national policy down to urban policy, down into how families decide to structure their everyday lives. So I think there's a lot of targeting of the family, not just men and women, but just the family unit as well. What kind of values do you instill in your family? The nation is asking the Muslim family, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. And it's really interesting to see kind of comparisons in the UK context with, like, prevent strategies, for example, and all these. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Amani. And I'll just pass over to Marcus.
Sure. Hi there. That was a really interesting presentation, Amani. And I see a lot of parallels between research that I've done in Scotland with young adult migrants and your research, particularly in Copenhagen. And I think, like, there's a lot of this minimizing going on when I'm speaking with them about, okay, they've encountered this racist behavior, but really it's they go to lengths to explain why they need to make people understand their difference, and then it's okay. And there's this idea in Scotland, this kind of narrative that we don't have a problem with racism here. So almost by calling out and saying, look, I've been victim to this racism or Islamophobia, that you're kind of positioning yourself as the other because you're going against the mainstream narrative. And I think it's maybe kind of caught up in the nationalist politics here as well, you know. So again, to align with this broader idea that Scotland doesn't have a problem with racism, you know, is kind of the way that you try and get by. So I wondered if that's something that you've noticed as well in your research, particularly in Denmark.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the Scottish example, because I've looked at Scotland a lot, and people kind of see, I don't know, here down in the south in London, they kind of see Scotland as you know, oh, this is much better than we have here. I however have a feeling that Scotland is very similar to Denmark on these issues where racism is not acknowledged. And it's funny because Quebec, where I also did research with young Muslims, it's exactly the same thing that's prevalent, you know, in a context, in a nationalist context, an ethno-nationalist context like Quebec and Denmark, where it's about being the right, linguistically, culturally, phenotypically the right type of Quebecer or right type of Dane. At the same time that this nationalist rhetoric exists, there's also such a lack of understanding of racism and racializing structures and how these play into to policies in a colorblind way. Like they will not say, non-white others need to be discriminated, but it just seeps through, and the inequalities we see in in encounters, both in socioeconomic positioning within society and so on, is really stark. But then you have these young people who have to navigate not being able to not having the ability to speak against it, because it's such a powerful understanding, that really goes down to the self understanding of Danes, the normal Dane will not see themselves as inherently racist, and also that's beyond the point. The point is, if structures are privileging certain population groups rather than others, then we can talk about racializing structures, and then we can also see why they just, and I think especially with young Muslims that are successful or on their way to be successful, it's really about saving themselves. Like, a lot of these young people that I spoke to, did not necessarily come from middle-class backgrounds. They lived and still live in social or public housing in Denmark. But for them to kind of create that social mobility for themselves, they need a job, and it doesn't help to have a master's degree. You also need to be employed. And if you need to be employed, then it's about me stepping up, and not about, like, she has the power to hire me or not hire me. Then I can talk about her being a racist all day long, but if the structures privilege her and I have nowhere to turn and call out her discrimination, then I just have to make her like me. Does that make sense? I think it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this again in the future. I've actually got to run off to another meeting, but thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. Thanks so much. And thank you, Amani, for your response. And I just think, just to end, we'll just have Scarlett's question. She's been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Sadia. Are you sure I've definitely got time? Okay, great. And can you hear me okay as well? Great. Okay, thank you so much to everyone on the panel and contributors. It was a really, really interesting discussion. And Amani, I want to thank you in particular for your kind of theoretical and conceptual thoroughness around discussing Islamophobia. A lot of what you talked about really resonated with some of my research on anti-racism and responses to Islamophobia, both in Scotland and England. And I could say a lot about Scotland. I'm really glad that Marcus said a bit about the Scottish context and the similarities there. But actually what I want to ask very quickly is just if you had any thoughts or insights into how or whether at all Islamophobia is approached in anti-racist work or anti-racist activism in Denmark. I don't know much about, you know, the anti-racist scene in Denmark, but I'd be interested in that, because I found that actually lots of anti-racists that I spoke to kind of hadn't really got to grips really with the racialization of Muslims and the notion of cultural racism. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I'm sorry, I tend to rant when I answer questions, but I don't mind if people need to trickle out off and leave, but I think it's an important question to ask. And it's something that I've thought a lot about in the Danish context. I think there's and this is from my own activism with Islamophobia in Denmark. I specifically work with activists looking at Islamophobia, and our engagements with other groups who are anti-racist groups. There's a difference when we're talking about who gets it and who doesn't. I think if you look at Black Lives Matter in Denmark, I think they get it in a different way than, for instance, white anti-racist allies, because I think there's in the Danish left, there's this, I don't know how to specify it, but there's this uneasiness with Islam as a religion and how Muslims are then targeted. So for instance, they'll be very against, they'll be very against Muslims not being able to wear a headscarf at work, a hijab at work or school. But on a social level, can't you just join us at the pub, just to hang out, or like there's certain levels of issues, so they can see that the government's rhetoric towards Muslims in housing and trying to culturally surveil them and control them is really off. But then there's an uneasiness of how this is expressed in everyday life and how this affects Muslims in everyday life. And I think there's a conversation there to be had. And I think in Denmark, especially, because a lot of racism in general is as I was mentioning, it's intersecting, xenophobia, hostile border control, anti-Blackness, and Islamophobia all at once. And you can do that when you have an asylum seeker who's Muslim and Black and, a woman. And, so there's a lot of ways that these types of racisms intersect. But I think I haven't studied it per se as you have, but I think there's something there and a conversation there. Not to say that it's not something that can be, I think it's something that is dealt with through collaboration in activist circles, but it is definitely something that's difficult to come to grips with. How Islamophobia is not your typical type of racism, how it's much more, it's expressed much more socially and culturally, if that makes sense. I'm just reading up on the comments. Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. It's really, really interesting to get your perspective on that. Thank you so much.
Is there any other questions, or are people having to rush off?
So I think we're probably done, but I'd really like to say thank you very much to Amani and to Hawa and Samiha for the questions as well. That was a great start to our academic year of seminars.
Thank you.
Sorry, so sorry, my screen got stuck. Thanks, Bridget. And what's the next seminar?
Does anyone remember?
I can't remember what the next seminar is. It the one with Dr. Anna McSaha and
Okay.
doing.
Oh, and yeah, what really great scholar from America as well. That will be very different, I think, but will be really interesting.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much to everyone for attending, and especially a massive thanks to Dr. Amani for sharing such important research, and to Samia and Hawa from the OSCH Collective for their thoughtful responses to the research, and also to those of you who asked some really important questions. And like Bridget said, we've got another Code seminar coming up, so please do follow us on the socials, on Code and on OSCH Young People, and you can keep track of new workshops and activities and events and so on. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Samia and Hawa, for such a good discussion as well. And thanks for